Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And we are meeting once again with lecture 30th of modern novel, that is novel 2. And as I mentioned in my previous lecture that we are starting with our revision series of the semester, where we'll be revising all our text as well as writers who wrote them for examination purposes as well as for revision purposes. So here we go. I am starting this lesson with James Joyce's masterpiece, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. If you would remember, this was the first text we did in this semester. So this talk is going to be a comprehensive talk on A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man that will enable you to revise the entire text in one sitting. So let's start with today's talk that is going to cover a total revision of the text by James Joyce. So, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce is a narrative that is an autobiographical novel. And it was written in Terraced in 1907, and its publication was basically 1916, and that was the possible date. The narrative is a kind of story where the narrator is anonymous and speaks with the same voice and tone that Stephen might. So somehow, somewhere we feel that maybe Stephen is the spokesman or Stephen is the narrator, but no, narrator Stephen is not the narrator. However, yes, he uses the same tone as Stephen. So although most of A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is in the third person, the point of view is Stephen's as Stephen develops as a person. The language and perspective of the narrative develops with him. We see everything in the manner in which he thinks and feels it. At the very end of the novel, there is a brief section in which the story is told through Stephen's diary entries. So here we come and get to know stream of conscious again. This section is in the first person. The tone is generally serious and introspective, especially during Stephen's several heartfelt epiphanies. We know what is epiphany. Epiphany is a moment of realization. How this epiphany helps Stephen in particular, we are going to discuss in today's talk. And most of the time the tense is past. The time where the novel is set is between 1882 to 1903, and it's primarily Dublin setting and the surrounding area. The protagonist of the story is Stephen Dedalus, and Stephen struggles to decide whether he should be loyal to his family, his religion, his nation, or his vocation as an artist. That's the major conflict that James Joyce presents in his masterpiece. Now, how the story builds up, where Stephen's encounters with prostitutes, his emotional reaction to Father Arnold's hellfire sermons, that he must confront the decision of his temporary devotion to religious life, his realization that he must confront the decision of whether to center his life around religion or his own desire, that is art. So the story reaches a climax where Stephen's decision in chapter 4 to reject the religious life takes place in favor of the life of an artist. And from there the following action starts that involves Stephen's enrollment in University College, where he gradually forms his aesthetic theory. Stephen's distancing of himself from his family, religion, and nation finally becomes his fate. The major themes in the novel are the development of individual consciousness, the pitfalls of religious extremism, the role of the artist, and the need for Irish autonomy, jingoism, nationalism, patriotism, all these flavors you will have in this writing. The major motifs and symbols which have been used by James Joyce in order to strengthen his thematic structure and goals for the story involve music, flight, prayers, secular songs, Latin phrases, colors, especially green and maroon, Emma as a person, the girl on the beach. Now, the foreshadowing Stephen's heartfelt emotional and aesthetic experiences foreshadow his ultimate acceptance of the life of an artist. Additionally, Joyce often refers to Stephen's vague sense, even very early in his life, that a great destiny awaits him. So, after this precise introduction of the story, let us sink into its contextual background that will enable us to set our lenses to watch through how the story got into the shape in which it is right now. So, starting with the contextual background, James Joyce, the writer, was born on February 2nd in 1882 in the town of Radgar near Dublin, Ireland. He was the oldest of 10 children born to a well-meaning but financially inept father and a solemn, pious mother. So, this was his family financial status. Joyce's parents managed to scrap together enough money to send their talented son to the Clongswood College, a prestigious boarding school, and then to Belvedere College, where Joyce excelled as an actor and writer. Later, he attended University College in Dublin, where he became increasingly committed to language and literature as a champion of modernism. In 1902, Joyce left the university and moved to Paris, but briefly returned to Ireland in 1903 upon the death of his mother. Shortly after his mother's death, Joyce began work on the story that would later become a portrait of the artist as a young man. Published in serial in 1914 to 1915, a portrait of the artist as a young man draws on many details from Joyce's early life. That is why it is called autobiographical novel. The novel's protagonist, Stephen, is in many ways Joyce's fictional double. Joyce had even published stories under the pseudonym Stephen Dedalus before writing the novel. Like Joyce himself, Stephen is the son of an impoverished father and a highly devoted Catholic mother. Also like Joyce, he attends Clongswood, Belvedere and University College, struggling with questions of faith and nationality before leaving Ireland to make his own way as an artist. Many of the scenes in the novel are fictional, but some of its most powerful moments are autobiographical. Both the Christmas dinner scene and Stephen's first sexual experience with the Dublin prostitutes closely resemble actual events in Joyce's life. In addition to drawing heavily on Joyce's personal life, a portrait of the artist also makes a number of references to the politics and religion of early 20th century in Ireland. When Joyce was growing up, Ireland had been under British rule since the 16th century, and tensions between Ireland and Britain had been spatially high since the potato blight of 1845. In addition to political strife, there was considerable religious tension. The majority of Irish, including the Joyce, were Catholics and strongly favored Irish independence. The Protestant minority, on the other hand, mostly wished to remain united with Britain. And this was the major conflict that divided the country in two major groups. Around the time Joyce was born, the Irish nationalist Charles Stewart Parnell was spearheading the movement for Irish independence. In 1890, however, Parnell's long-standing affair with a married woman was exposed, leading the Catholic Church to condemn him and causing many of his former followers to turn against him. That was a big political turnover. Many Irish nationalists blamed Parnell's death, which occurred only a year later. On the Catholic Church, indeed, we see these strong opinions about Parnell's surface in a portrait of the artist during an emotional Christmas dinner argument among members of the Daedalus family. So what happens that by 1900, the Irish people felt that they felt largely united in demanding freedom from British rule. In the story, the young Stephen's friend at university college frequently confront him with political questions about his struggle between Ireland and England. So after completing the story, a portrait in Zurich in 1915, Joyce returned to Paris, where he wrote two more major novels, Essays and Fingon's Wake, over the course of the next several years. These three novels, along with a short story collection, Dubliners, from the core of his remarkable literary career, is something that his followers and lovers would never forget. And he died in 1941. So, this was the contextual background of the story. Today, Joyce is celebrated as one of the great literary pioneers of the 20th century. He was one of the first writers to make extensive and convincing use of stream of consciousness, the writing technique, a stylistic form in which written prose seeks to represent the character's stream of inner thoughts and perceptions and feelings rather than render these characters from an objective external perspective. This technique used in the novel mostly during the opening sections that in chapter 5 sometimes make for different and difficult readings, and you feel like reading the text again and again in order to really grasp it. With effort, however, the seemingly jumbled up perceptions of stream of consciousness can crystallize into a clean and coherent and sophisticated portrayal of a character's experience and the true self. Another stylistic technique for which Joyce is noted and famous is the epiphany, a moment in which a character makes a sudden, profound realization, whether prompted by an external object or a voice from within that creates a change in his or her perception of the world. Joyce uses epiphany most notably in Dubliners, but a portrait is also full of these sudden moments of spiritual revelation as well. Most notable is a scene in which Stephen sees a young girl wading at the beach, which strikes him with the sudden realization that an appreciation for beauty can be truly good, and changes his life upside down. This moment is a classic example of Joyce's belief that an epiphany can dramatically alter the human spirit in a matter of just a few seconds. So, finishing with the contextual background and the introductory talk, let's start with the plot overview and see how the story is knitted together. So, starting with the plot overview of a portrait of the artist as a young man, the narrative tells us the story of Stephen Daedalus, a boy growing up in Ireland at the end of the 19th century, as he gradually decides to cast off all his social, familial and religious constraints to live a life devoted to the art of writing. As a young boy, Stephen's Catholic faith and Irish nationality heavily influence him. He attends a strict religious boarding school called Clongowes College. At first, Stephen is lonely and homesick at the school, but as time passes, he finds his place among the other boys. He enjoys his visits home, even though family tensions run high after the death of the Irish political leader Charles Stewart. This sensitive subject becomes the topic of a furious, politically charged argument over the family's Christmas dinner. Stephen's father, Simon, is inept with money, and the family sinks deeper and deeper into debt. After a summer spent in the company of his uncle Charles, Stephen learns that the family cannot afford to send him back to Clongowes, and that they will instead move to Dublin. Stephen starts attending a prestigious day school called Belvedere, where he grows to excel as a writer and as an actor in the student theatre. His first sexual experience with a young Dublin prostitute unleashes a storm of guilt and shame and embarrassment in Stephen as he tries to reconcile his physical desires with the stern Catholic morality of his surroundings. For a while, he ignores his religious upbringing, throwing himself with debauched abandon into a variety of sins, like many sins that Christianity would snub and forbid for, and more visits to prostitutes among others. Then on a 3-day religious retreat, Stephen hears a trio of fiery sermon about sin, judgment and hell. Deeply shaken, the young man resolves to rededicate himself to a life of Christian piety. Stephen begins attending Mass every day, becoming a model of Catholic piety, absentees and self-denial. His religious devotion is so pronounced that the director of his school asks him to consider entering the priesthood. After briefly considering the offer, Stephen realizes that the austerity of the priestly life is utterly incompatible with his love for sensual beauty. That day, Stephen learns from his sister that the family will be moving, once again for financial reason. Anxiously awaiting news about his acceptance to the university, Stephen goes for a walk on the beach, where he observes a young girl wading in the tide. He is struck by her beauty and realizes in a moment of epiphany that the love and desire of beauty should not be a source of shame. Stephen resolves to live his life to the fullest and vows not to be constrained by the boundaries of his family, his nation, as well as religion. Stephen moves on to the university, where he develops a number of strong friendships and is especially close with a young man named Cranley. In a series of conversations with his companions, Stephen works to formulate his theories about art. While he is dependent on his friends as listeners, he is also determined to create an independent existence, liberated from the expectations of friends as well as family. He becomes more and more determined to free himself from all limiting pressures, and eventually decides to leave Ireland to escape them. Like his namesake, the mythical Daedalus, Stephen hopes to build himself wings on which he can fly above all obstacles and achieve a life as an artist. This was the story that James Joyce present in weaving into thematic structures and goals that best present the life of 20th century or life of his own times. Now, let's have a look at the characters to see what kind of character representations we have in the story. First of all, we are going to discuss the protagonist of the story, of a portrait of the artist as a young man, Stephen Daedalus. Growing up, Stephen goes through long phases of hedonism and deep religious life. He eventually adopts a philosophy of aestheticism, greatly valuing beauty and art. And when he starts valuing beauty in art, then he does not care about the cost. That can be his family, his nation, or religion as well. Stephen is essentially Joyce's alter ego, and many of the events of Stephen's life mirror events from Joyce's own youth. Stephen's father, Simon, an impoverished former medical student with a strong sense of Irish patriotism. Basically, I guess Stephen's patriotic vibes come from his father. Sentimental about his past, Simon Daedalus frequently reminisces about his youth. And Mary Daedalus is Stephen's mother and Simon's Daedalus' wife. Mary is very religious and argues with her son about attending religious services. So religious vibes come from his mother. However, what he wants is altogether different from what is wanted by his mother as well as father. The Daedalus children, the siblings, though his siblings do not play a major role in the story, Stephen has several brothers and sisters, including Murky, Katie, Maggie, and Booty. Emma Clary, Stephen's beloved, the young girl to whom he is fiercely attracted over the course of many years. Stephen constructs Emma as an ideal of femininity, even though he does not know her very well. Mr. John Casey, Simon Daedalus' friend, who attends the Christmas dinner at which young Stephen is allowed to sit with the adults for the very first time. Like Simon, Mr. Casey is a staunch believer in Irish nationalism, and at the dinner he argues with Dante over the fate of Parnell. Charles Stewart, an Irish political leader who is not an actual character in the novel though, but whose death influences many of its characters in the story. Parnell had powerfully led the Irish National Party until he was condemned for having an affair with a married woman, that is against Catholic norms and religious instructions. Dante, Mrs. Riordan, the extremely fervent and piously Catholic governess of the Daedalus children. So now you would understand how these very extreme emotions of religion and patriotism are embedded into Stephen's character right from his childhood. Dante, whose real name is Mrs. Riordan, becomes involved in a long and unpleasant argument with Mr. Casey over the fate of Parnell during Christmas dinner, a highly political charged argument that resembles James Joyce's real life too. Uncle Charles, Stephen's lively great-uncle, Charles lives with Stephen's family. During the summer, the young Stephen enjoys taking long walks with his uncle and listening to Charles and Simon discuss the history of both Ireland and the Daedalus family. Ellen Vance, a young girl who lives near Stephen when he is a young boy. When Stephen tells Dante that he wants to marry Ellen, Dante is enraged because Ellen is a Protestant. Well, the rector at Congswold College is Father Conmy, where Stephen attends school as a young boy. Father Dolan, the cruel prefect of studies at Wood College. Wells, the bully at Wood College. Wells taunts Stephen for kissing his mother before he goes to bed, and one day he pushes Stephen into a filthy cesspool, causing Stephen to catch a bad fever. Atty, a friendly boy whom Stephen meets in the infirmary at Clongswood. Atty likes Stephen Daedalus because they both have unusual names. Brother Michael, the kindly brother who tends to Stephen and Atty in the college infirmary after Wells pushes Stephen into the cesspool. And Fleming, one of Stephen's friends at college. Father Arnold, Stephen's stern Latin teacher at college, who plays a very significant role in the shift of this character. When Stephen is at Belwood College, Father Arnold delivers a series of religious lectures on death and hell that have a profound influence on Stephen. Mike Flynn, a friend of Simon Daedalus, who tries with little success to train Stephen to be a runner during their summer at Black Rock. Abry Mills, a young boy with whom Stephen plays imaginary adventure games at Black Rock. And Vincent Heron, a rival of Stephen's at Belvedere. Bolland and Nash, two schoolmates of Stephen's at Belvedere, who taunt and bully him. Quite a lot of characters though. Cranley, quite an important character though, Stephen's best friend at the university in whom he confines his thoughts and feelings. He somehow plays a character of a clean surface with whom Stephen can have a good catharsis and can speak up his emotions straight away. In this sense, Cranley represents a secular confessor for Stephen. Eventually, Cranley begins to encourage Stephen to conform to the wishes of his family and to try harder to fit in with his peers, advice that Stephen fiercely resents. Davin, another of Stephen's friends at the university. Davin comes from the Irish provinces and has a simple, solid nature. Stephen admires his talent for athletics but disagrees with his unquestioning Irish patriotism, which Davin encourages Stephen to adopt. Lynch is another of Stephen's friend at the university, a coarse and often unpleasantly dry young man. Lynch is poorer than Stephen. Stephen explained his theory of aesthetics to Lynch in chapter 5. And some very few and precise characters. McCain, a fiercely political student at the university who tries to convince Stephen to be more concerned with politics. Temple, a young man at the university who openly admires Stephen's keen independence and tries to copy his ideas and sentiments. Dean of Studies, a Jesuit priest at University College. Johnny Cashman, a friend of Simon Daedalus. This was a list of characters that we should know quite well when we are reading the story. So after the list of characters, now we should move to the themes, symbols and motives which are shaping the story. So starting with the themes, the very first theme that is quite observable in the story is the development of individual consciousness. Perhaps the most famous aspect of a portrait of the artist as a young man is Joyce's innovative use of stream of consciousness, a style in which the author directly transcribes the thoughts and sensations that go through a character's mind rather than simply describing those sensations from the external standpoint of an observer. Joyce's use of stream of consciousness makes a portrait of the artist a story of the development of Stephen's mind. The first chapter, the very young Stephen is only capable of describing his world in simple words and phrases. The sensations that he experiences are all jumbled together with a child's lack of attention to cause and effect. Later, when Stephen is a teenager obsessed with religion, he is able to think in a clearer, more adult manner. Paragraphs are more logically ordered than in the opening sections of the novel, and thought's progress is quite logical. Stephen's mind is more mature and he is now more coherently aware of his surroundings than before. Nonetheless, he still trusts blindly in the church, and his passionate emotions of guilt and religious ecstasy are so strong that they get in the way of rational thought. It is only in the final chapter, where Stephen is in the university, that he seems truly rational. By the end of the novel, Joyce renders a portrait of a mind that has achieved emotional, intellectual and artistic adulthood. The development of Stephen's consciousness in a portrait is particularly interesting because insofar as Stephen's is a portrait of Joyce himself, Stephen's development gives us insight into the development of a literary genius, James Joyce. Stephen's experiences hint at the influences that transformed Joyce himself into the great writer he is considered today. Stephen's obsession with language, his strained relations with religion, family and culture, and his dedication to forging an aesthetic of his own mirror the ways in which Joyce related to the various tensions in his life during his formative years. In the last chapter of the novel, we also learn that genius, though in many ways a calling, also requires great work and considerable sacrifice. Watching Stephen's daily struggle to puzzle out his aesthetic philosophy, we get a sense of the great task that awaits him. Brought up in a devout Catholic family, Stephen initially ascribes to an absolute belief in the morals of the church. And this let us understand the second important theme of the novel, that is the pitfall of religious extremism. As a teenager, this belief leads him to two opposite extremes, both of which are harmful. At first, he falls into the extreme of sin, repeatedly sleeping with prostitutes and deliberately turning his back on religion. Though Stephen sins willfully, he is always aware that he acts in violation of the church's rule. Then when Father Arnold's speech prompts him to return to Catholicism, he bounces to the other extreme, becoming a perfect, near fanatical model of religious devotion and obedience. Eventually, however, Stephen realizes that both of these lifestyles, the completely sinful and the completely devout, are extremes that have been false and harmful. He does not want to lead a completely debauched life, but also rejects Catholicism because he feels that it does not permit him the full experience of being human. Stephen ultimately reaches a decision to embrace life and celebrate humanity after seeing a young girl waiting at the beach. To him, the girl is a symbol of pure goodness and of life lived to the fullest. A portrait of the artist as a young man explores what it means to become an artist. So the third important theme that comes up is the role of the artist, precisely in 20th century. Stephen's decision at the end of the novel to leave his family and friends behind and go into exile in order to become an artist suggests that Joyce sees the artist as a necessarily isolated figure. In his decision, Stephen turns his back on his community, refusing to accept the constraints of political involvement, religious devotion, and family commitment and pressures that the community places on its members. However, though the artist is an isolated figure, Stephen's ultimate goal is to give a voice to the very community that he is leaving. In the last few lines of the novel, Stephen expresses his desire to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race. He recognizes that his community will always be a part of him, as it has created and shaped his identity. When he creatively expresses his own ideas, he will also convey the voice of his entire community. Even as Stephen turns his back on the traditional forms of participation and membership in a community, he envisions his writing as a service to the community. And the fourth important theme, quite significant, is the need for Irish autonomy. Despite his desire to steer clear of politics, Stephen constantly ponders Ireland's place in the world. He concludes that the Irish have always been a subservient people, allowing outsiders to control them. In his conversation with the Dean of Studies at the university, he realizes that even the language of the Irish people really belongs to the English. Stephen's perception of Ireland's subservience has two effects on his development as an artist. First, it makes him determined to escape the bonds that his Irish ancestors have accepted. As we see in his conversation with Devon, Stephen feels an anxious need to emerge from his Irish heritage as his own person, free from the shackles that have traditionally confined his country. Do you fancy I am going to pay in my own life and person debts they made? Second, Stephen's perception makes him determined to use his art to reclaim autonomy of his country. Using the borrowed language of English, he plans to write in a style that will be both autonomous from England, and true to the Irish people. And here we start with the motives now. Music is one important motive used by James Joyce, especially in forms of song in this novel. Music, especially singing, appears repeatedly throughout our portrait. The story, Stephen's appreciation of music, is closely tied to his love for the sounds of language. As a very young child, he turns Dante's threats into a song. As I take it from the text, a reference, apologize, pull out his eyes, apologize. Singing is more than just language, however, it is language transformed by vibrant humanity. Indeed, music appeals to the part of Stephen's that wants to live life to the fullest. We see this aspect of music near the end of the novel when Stephen suddenly feels at peace upon hearing a woman singing. Her voice prompts him to recall his resolution to leave Ireland and become a writer, reinforcing his determination to celebrate life through writing. Stephen Dedalus' very name embodies the idea of flight as another motive. Stephen's namesake, Daedalus, is a figure from Greek mythology, a renowned craftsman who designs the famed labyrinth of Crete for King Minos. Minos keeps Daedalus and his son Lycaris imprisoned on Crete, but Daedalus makes plans to escape by using feathers, twin and wax to fashion a set of wings for himself and his son. Daedalus escapes successfully, but Lycaris flies too high. The sun heat melts the wax holding Lycaris' wings, and his wings burned together, and he plumets to his death in the sea. In the context of a portrait, we can see Stephen as representative of both Daedalus and Lycaris, as Stephen's father also has the last name of Daedalus. With this mythological reference, Joyce implies that Stephen must always balance his desire to flee Ireland with the danger of overestimating his own abilities, the intellectual equivalent of Lycaris' flight too close to the sun. To diminish the dangers of attempting too much too soon, Stephen bides his time at the university, developing his aesthetic theory fully before attempting to leave Ireland and write seriously. The birds that appear to Stephen in the third section of chapter 5 signal that it is finally time for Stephen, now fully formed as an artist, to take flight himself. And some other motive includes prayers, secular songs, and Latin phrases. We can often tell Stephen's state of mind by looking at the fragments of prayers, songs, and Latin phrases that Joyce inserts in the text. When Stephen is a schoolboy, Joyce includes childish, sincere prayers that mirror the manner in which a child might devotedly believe in the church, even without understanding the meaning of its religious doctrine. When Stephen prays in church, despite the fact that he has committed a mortal sin, Joyce transcribes a long passage of the Latin prayer, but it is clear that Stephen merely speaks the words without believing them. Then when Stephen is at the university, Latin is used as a joke. His friends translate colloquial phrases like peace over the whole bloody globe into Latin because they find the academic sound of the translation amusing. This jocular use of Latin makes both the young men's education and the stern, serious manner in which Latin is used in the church. These linguistic jokes demonstrate that Stephen is no longer serious about religion. Family, religion and nation, which were his obsession in the beginning, very shortly during this transformation time period, changed into altogether his own desire, his own thirst for art, and that stands as beauty for him. Finally, Joyce includes a few lines from the Irish folk song Rosie O'Grady near the end of the novel. These simple lines reflect the peaceful feeling that the song brings to Stephen and Cranley, as well as the traditional Irish culture that Stephen plans to leave behind. Throughout the novel, such prayers, songs, and phrases from the background of Stephen's life play very important role in discussing the linguistic placement of English and French by James Joyce. Well, the sharp contrast presented by the writer, like good versus bad. Wells represents bad in the novel because Stephen has had terrible experiences with Wells. Stephen remembers that Wells knocked him over the day before. He did not like Wells' face. It was Wells who had shouldered him into the square ditch the day before. In the very beginning of the novel, one of the first things that happens to Stephen is that he wets the bed. In almost all instances, wetting the bed is bad. After wetting the bed, Stephen's mother changes soiled, wet sheets and replaces them with oil sheets, which Stephen considers to be good. Hot versus cold. In most parts, Stephen associates hot with good thoughts and cold with bad thoughts. Stephen always seems to feel happier when he is warm in his bed under his warm sheets. Stephen is unable to sleep if his sheets are cold. However, in some instances, warmth is portrayed as bad by Stephen. When he is sick, Stephen feels extremely hot. Also, when Stephen is smacked on the hand by Father Dolan, his hands are on fire and his throat is scaling. Whenever Stephen mentions cold, he always seems to want to get rid of the cold as fast as possible, like with his sheets. Stephen also relates cold with uncomfortable situations he encounters. For example, his hands become cold when Nasty Roach teases Stephen about his name and what kind of man his father is. And another sharp contrast of light and dark. Stephen associates darkness in his school with cold. Shows that just like how he isn't fond of cold, he doesn't like dark either. Dark represents fear in most cases. When Father Arnold scolds Fleming for not knowing the answer to a question, Stephen describes Father Arnold's face as dark. Dark is mentioned when Stephen goes to the rector's office. Stephen is always happy to see lights on in the castle and wants to be in the light. Light represents this occasion when Stephen is happy. Sunlight is prevalent when Stephen wakes up in the infirmary feeling better. Beauty, art, books, word, so on and so forth. Art had little focus in the first chapter though. Although Fleming had a box of crayons and one night during free study he had colored the earth green and the clouds maroon. Stephen had experienced art as he walked down the dark narrow corridor to find the rector's office. He thought he saw the portraits of the saints and great men of the order looking down at him. The subject of books began with the bedtime story told on the first page by Stephen's father and was a symbol of something rare to have. With all the studying required for the school Stephen went to going to the infirmary to get better slowly was one of the only times you could get a book. The book Stephen was interested in was on about Holland, where there were lovely foreign names and pictures of strange-looking cities and ships. James Joyce's diction expressed more detail about the characters and the world they lived in. His words show Stephen's feeling and thoughts. Queer was used multiple items to mean strange or weird. Wax showed anger, disappointment, and even embarrassment. Slimy was utilized many times to describe the courts of rats and water around the school. Because they are slimy and they give that feeling. Lovely depicted Stephen's bed during the winter and Christmas. Gold and white were used as descriptions of Alan's hands and the hands of the Blessed Virgin. Soft and grey described the sky during the winter months at their school. Water is generally seen in the novel as bad and described as dirty or cold. When you wet the bed, first it is warm, then it gets cold. He shivered as if he had cold, slimy water next his skin. Stephen was pushed into a cesspool by Wells. Stephen seems unhappy and has not really found himself yet, as so water is seen cold and slimy. Eventually, as Stephen grows older and figures out his life, water around him might clear up or it might not be described as cold. A heavy bird flying low through the grey light. Bird as a symbol. Footballers, the greasy leather, or flew like a heavy bird. They might later symbolize Stephen flying away and escape all that surrounds him. Maze and labyrinth. When Stephen had to wind his way through the hallways to the rector's office, Stephen also had to overcome his nervousness of talking to the rector about the flogging he received. Stephen might be faced with a conflict or maze, and he might need to overcome some conflict, possibly some kind of establishment of identity. And the colors green and maroon. Stephen associates the green color and maroon with his governess, Dante, and with two leaders of the Irish resistance, Charles and Michael David. In a dream after Parnell's death, Stephen sees Dante dressed in green and maroon as the Irish people mourn their fallen leader. This vision indicates that Stephen associates the two colors with the way Irish politics are played out among the members of his own family. Emma appears only in glimpses throughout most of Stephen's young life, and he never gets to know her as a person. Instead, she becomes a symbol of pure love, untainted by sexuality or reality. Stephen worships Emma as the idol of feminine purity. The argument, Catholic versus Irish nationalist, is basically one contemporary issue that sets very well in the story and shaped the story as well. The clash between the Catholics and Irish nationalists split the Christmas dinner. Dante, a Catholic, fights with Mr. Daedalus and Mr. Casey, both nationalists. Dante defends the church and priest, citing that they are the apple of God's eye. On the other hand, Mr. Casey views them as traitors. Didn't the Bishop of Ireland betray us in the time of the Union? Both sides essentially do the same thing. They call each other names and argue about whether Parnell was a hero or villain. Stephen begins the dinner by describing the adults as good role models. His father said quietly and kindly, "What are you laughing at, you little puppy?" However, as the argument begins, Stephen sees the less spectacular sides of Dante, Mr. Casey and his father. Dante is revealed to be a spoiled nun. Mr. Casey fights with Dante and finally says blasphemously, "No God for Ireland." And finally, Stephen sees that his eyes were full of tears, showing his helplessness and an inability to change the dinner. During the dinner, the adults slowly take away Stephen's innocence with their foul behavior and argument. Mr. Daedalus begins by calling the language of the Holy Ghost bad. Mr. Daedalus then calls the church subordinates Billy with the lip, tub of the guts, and then sons of bitches. Mr. Casey brags about spitting in an old woman's eye. At the end of the argument, Stephen is forced to watch all of the adults argue. And now some important questions for your preparation for the exams. So, what do you think? How is Stephen influenced by his Irish nationality? Is the question based on one very significant theme of the story that you probably need to process for your examination. Then discussing Joyce's use of religious imagery and language is another important area that demands your attention, involving why are Father Arnold's 3 sermons so successful in overcoming Stephen's religious doubts. What role does Stephen's arguing sexuality play in his development as a character will help you involve all the major themes, motives and symbols in your discussion, allowing you to describe how does his Catholic morality complicate his experience of sexuality. Comparing and contrasting Stephen's perception of art with his perception of religion, family, school or country is another important area that demands your attention. What makes art such an appealing escape for Stephen is something that will help you compare and contrast his early young life and the life after he receives sermons and is able to decide for himself. And in the end, why does Stephen turn down the offer to become a Jesuit is one important question that I think almost cover all of what we have discussed so far in the story. Some more question for your interest. However, I hope I discussed all these questions during the mainstream lectures based on the novel by James Joyce. However, preparing on these questions will help you to overcome any ambiguity, any confusions you have regarding the story and make you prepared for your final examination. That was all for the comprehensive talk based on James Joyce's writing. And now I will see you in the next lecture, lecture 31st. That is another second last lecture of the revision series. Allah Hafiz.